So this is the other side of the carbon cycle equation, right? So NPP is the inputs, decomposition is the outputs. And we're going to talk about the fate of the products of the NPP, right? So what is the fate of most of NPP? Where's it go? Respiration. It gets respired, right? So it just goes right back into the atmosphere. And every single year, there's, even at the global scale, there's a very, very small fraction of NPP that doesn't get decomposed, right? And where does that go?
Either biomass or...
It goes into biomass, but the NPP, so there's some amount of NPP that stays as biomass, so growth every year would be the sort of net product of the biomass product of that. But if you have the different decomposition and NPP both sort of happening at the same time, and most of it's going right back to CO2, the rest of it is just accumulating. That's the soil organic matter, right? So all of the organic matter that's on in ecosystems is essentially is reflecting the fact that NPP, right, is slightly greater than decomposition on an annual basis, right? And if you could figure out how to actually increase the proportion of NPP that stays in soils, you could win a Nobel Prize, right? And this is part of a, you see this. Actually, there was this, you guys do follow science stuff on Twitter? It's kind of sad, but I don't have much time to read anymore, right? I can't. The literature has there's such a volume of science that's published on a daily basis. I can never keep up with it. But by social media has become a really important way for me to keep up with stuff that's in my field. And yesterday I saw something that was put out by Stanford in the communications office at Stanford University about the power of soils to actually help mitigate climate change. And soils mitigate climate change by this interaction, right? So especially in agricultural ecosystems, there's very little, actually in many agricultural ecosystems, decomposition outpaces NPP. And we know that because over time, soils get degraded, right? And they lose organic matter. That's why in agricultural systems, we put soils as use cover crops or fallow soils to rebuild organic matter, right? And help it essentially increase the stock. But globally, agriculture has been a net loss of CO2 from ecosystems or a net loss of carbon. But there's the potential, if managed properly, to actually increase the proportion of carbon that gets stored in soils, right? And if you can do that, right, and even over relatively short timescales, that can actually help mediate carbon increases in the atmosphere. So I would argue it's one of a set of strategies that could be used, and one that is, when you think about all the different ways we could mitigate climate change or kind of regulate or manage the carbon cycle, storing carbon in soils or figuring out ways to manage soils that increases carbon in soils is a pretty low-hanging fruit, I would argue, as opposed to like, we're gonna launch 1 billion tiny little mirrors into the atmosphere to reflect solar radiation, right? It's a little more complicated. Okay, so decomposition. So this is the other side of the balance, and if you look here at sort of the global carbon cycle, let me see if I have a meter here. Right, largely especially before anthropogenic CO2 emissions, right, the amount of carbon coming into the atmosphere, or coming into vegetation from the atmosphere or into ecosystems, about 100 gigatons per year. And you can see 50 coming out as soil or heterotrophic respiration and 50 coming out as autotrophic respiration, suggesting, right, before anthropogenic CO2 emissions became such a big deal, that the terrestrial biosphere, or actually the global biosphere, applies to oceans as well, that the carbon cycle, inputs of carbon were roughly balanced by losses of carbon. Okay, and now we know that this term has changed. All of these have changed dramatically as we've increased fossil carbon emissions to the atmosphere, right? And this is all the talk about sources, ecosystems being sinks for carbon, right? But we add a whole bunch of carbon every year to the atmosphere, and that has created the carbon cycle is distinctly not at steady state anymore. Anytime where you would have a system in which losses were balanced by inputs, that would be considered a steady state, right? So just to review a little bit, GPP that photosynthesis on an ecosystem scale, minus plant respiration, that's net primary production. Okay, and another term that we need to think about is ecosystem productivity. So that would be gross primary productivity minus plant respiration minus heterotrophic respiration. Okay, and heterotrophic respiration is dominated by what's happening in soils. Right, the actual proportion of CO2 losses through things like animals is very, 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 very small. Mostly this is reflecting what bacteria and fungi are doing in soils. Okay, and so again, to measure at an ecosystem scale, you could get an estimate of decomposition by measuring soil respiration. Anyone know how you do that? How do we measure soil respiration?
At ecovariance tower.
Okay, what's that?
That ecovariance tower is a tower that you put on a landscape, and as the wind, if the wind's blowing, it works. Hopefully.
And if you're not in complex terrain.
And if you're not, right, there's a lot of assumptions, and there's a turbulent layer, a boundary layer in the air along the surface, and it makes really high frequency measurements of the direction of the wind up and down, or three-dimensionally, and it has a gas analyzer that makes a measurement of the concentration of CO2 or H2O in other cases.
Exactly. So it's just basically a big tower that's measuring meteorology and flow of air, and then measuring differences in carbon concentrations through time, right? And so when you have concentrations of carbon that are greater than what normal atmospheric or ambient CO2 concentrations would be, that would suggest that carbon is being respired, right? And if it becomes lower than atmospheric concentrations, that would be a time in which plants are actually photosynthesizing and taking that up. So this is one of the ways that sort of a regional scale, right, or a derived way of measuring soil respiration, okay? And it works, and it's millions, if not more, hundreds of millions of dollars have been invested in networks of sites to actually put these towers up. And these towers are used for all sorts of things, but one of them is to, and one of the focus and reasons they established them was to try and get a sense of what is the net carbon balance of ecosystems, right? How much is coming in versus how much is going out. How else do people measure soil respiration? Yeah.
Carbon mineralization rates.
How do you do that?
The only way I know is taking a soil sample and giving it a bunch of carbon and measuring how much CO2 comes out.
You don't even have to give it a bunch of carbon. You can just put it in the lab. You can do it like in a closed system, close up a soil piece of, or a sample of soil, measure CO2 accumulation over time, and that would give you a sense of respiration rates. Or you can do it in the field, right? Just put a chamber over a piece of land or a piece of soil or a plot and measure as the CO2 concentration builds up in the chamber. You sample it, run it through the same sort of instruments that these eddy towers have, and you can get a sense of how much fluxes of carbon out of soils. How do you do it in streams? Anyone know how you do it in streams? How do you get a sense of respiration rates in streams?
O2. O2.
O2.
DO, sorry. It's all talking.
Okay, how? What's the walk us through that?
Diel variation is you see a boom during the day when you have photosynthesis, and then it consumes oxygen at night.
Yeah, so in streams they tend to focus more on oxygen and oxygen concentrations as opposed to CO2 concentrations. So you can measure net productivity would be the production of oxygen, consumption or decomposition, respiration would be measured by a decrease in oxygen concentrations. And mostly, how do you do that? What's the system for doing that? Patrick,
Sorry?
So we could use towers or chambers in terrestrial ecosystems. How do we do it in streams?
We use hobo.
Oboe.
A little hobo, O2 sensors, and just.
So in real time in a stream, you just put a sensor in a stream.
Yeah, we use multiple of them, but yeah.
Okay. So, and that's typically how it's done how do they do it in the oceans? They actually use bottles out in the oceans and and they spike bottles with carbon dioxide, C14 carbon dioxide, and actually can trace wear and fluxes of carbon using these bottles, small samples, and when they add an isotope, they can trace CO2. Okay, so, but this net ecosystem production is a very relevant and important topic now, because again, this represents the kind of the net carbon balance of ecosystems. So lots of people are trying to figure out which ecosystems have positive NEP, right? So where gross primary productivity minus respiration is a positive number, those would be ecosystems that are accumulating carbon, right, with positive net ecosystem productivity. And the other side of that, systems that are, those are typically known as aggrading ecosystems, okay, as opposed to degrading ecosystems where respiration, the combination of these two is higher than GPP, and those are systems that are losing carbon. Okay, so graphically, this is over time, right? So typically what you would predict is that early in ecosystem development, NPP outpaces respiration, with the difference being carbon that's accumulating in ecosystems, right? That over time, as I was mentioning last time, you would expect mature ecosystems would generally move towards a steady state where carbon inputs are equal to losses. And that this is kind of what we were talking about last time, right? Is like if you were thinking about managing ecosystems for carbon balance, ideally you would want to manage them in a way that the difference between gross productivity and respiration was the highest. Okay? But there's some challenges with that and things that other things. This is conceptually, this is very straightforward, but practically and logistically in terms of measuring and getting a sense, this is going to, the shape of this may generally be consistent across ecosystems, but certainly the time is going to change depending on where you are. Allocation, all these different things could affect generally what this would look like. Did you guys get the Harmon paper I sent? Okay, so that was one of the very first studies done in response to this notion that we should just be sort of keeping our forests all at about 40 or 30 years old, right? And as you get older, this difference between these declines, right? And so you're not maximizing carbon uptake. But the reality is that biomass isn't included on this, right? And measuring total respiration and getting a really good sense of what total respiration is and how it varies is also very complicated, just like it is to measure global scale productivity or even small scale productivity. Okay, so these are, anything in here would be an ecosystem that's aggrading, so it's gaining carbon, and that's soil organic matter, and ecosystems that are losing carbon are generally degrading. What sort of systems would you expect to be losing besides agriculture systems that are losing carbon?
Maybe like really old growth forests with very little like surface cover,
okay.
Surface plants. And
certainly older ecosystems, you would expect the difference between those to go down. Most of the time, if systems are losing more carbon than they're gaining, then they're not very, those systems are probably, if they're not in steady state and they're losing, degrading ecosystems, they're probably going to change ultimately, so they would be fundamentally different. What sorts of things would change a system from gaining carbon to losing carbon? Disturbances. Right, and so that's the time component. And we know in ecosystems that disturbances generally in natural ecosystems are what move ecosystems back and forth, right? So like all this hurricane damage, right, to ecosystems in the Caribbean right now, or right back in over here, right? And now we would expect that systems would, as they recover, they would increase NPP, respiration would increase in parallel. What we don't account for in here is all that biomass and all that organic matter that's now potentially more susceptible to decomposition. So early on, following a disturbance, I would actually expect these lines would be flipped, right? So early on, before plants have actually started growing vigorously, but you have all this carbon that's been sitting on the ground now from dead vegetation and soils that are exposed to the atmosphere, and more, that actually decomposition for a few years at least would be higher than productivity, okay, until the plant productivity catches back up.
Slides from
That was from Odom.
Here's Odom, yeah.
Luke did a presentation on Odom last
I
week.
know, Luke is fond of Odom, so am I. Well, I have lots of Odom throughout my, we'll come back to Odom when we talk about a lot of this stuff is sort of how ecosystems respond to disturbance. And this is just a really nice sort of graphical representation about how the carbon cycle responds to disturbance. Okay, so again, this is part 2 of the 50% rule of ecosystem ecology. So I told you that about half of gross primary productivity gets translated to things other than plant respiration. So about half of GPP is plant respiration. Same thing with NPP. About half of NPP is lost to soil respiration. Okay? So, actually, that's not true. I take that back. Most of NPP is lost to soil respiration. That's what this is showing. Okay, and so that again reflects the fact that even in systems that are accumulating carbon, they're accumulating it incrementally. Okay, would never expect a system where NPP is vastly greater than soil respiration. Most of the NPP is lost as heterotrophic respiration. Does that make sense? Sorry, that was confusing. Okay, so this is NPP in soil respiration for 9 terrestrial biomes. Let's see. This includes agricultural lands, boreal forests, woodlands, blah, blah, blah. And you can see a really nice relationship. Again, very uncommon to see such tight relationships here, but mostly what's coming into ecosystems on an annual basis, right, per year is going out, with just maybe a tiny little difference between those. Where in the world would you expect this net ecosystem productivity, so the difference between productivity and respiration, to be highest? Where are the ecosystems, just guess, where you would think about ecosystems? And if I mentioned that storage, right, it's storage. We need to think about which ecosystems are storing the most amount of carbon, and it's stored as soils, so which ecosystems have the most carbon sitting in soils?
Peat bogs.
Okay, so where are those?
Most boreal systems.
Okay, so systems that have clearly lots of organic matter sitting in them, right? That actually reflects the fact that decomposition, it certainly reflects the fact that decomposition doesn't have as much NPP, but productivity is actually very low in those ecosystems too, and so what we're really seeing is the effects of time. Okay, but in systems, maybe not think about soils as much, but where would you expect on the Odom curve I just showed you systems to be kind of more near that end where you have higher differences between productivity and respiration? How about systems that have been recently disturbed? So which systems on a large scale have been relatively recently disturbed?
Recently glaciated landscapes.
Okay, so more recent.
Hurricanes.
Okay, so areas, well, hurricanes for sure, but hurricanes are fairly small scales disturbances.
Burns.
Okay, so fires, ecosystems that are recovering from fire. What else? Think about the eastern United States. Anyone from the eastern United States? What's going on in the east that's different than it was 150 years ago?
There's no more sheep. Well, the trees are growing back, essentially.
Why are they growing back?
Because there's no more sheep.
So they've, especially in temperate forests, right, that we cut down most of the temperate forests, right, in the eastern part of the United States, and now they're all growing back, right? And so ecosystems where you've had major disturbances and anthropogenic land use especially. So temperate forests, where else? Land use become a very important part of the landscape, or deforestation. Yes. So this is a picture of sort of this is from Bonin and Forest in 2008. That was whole part of a whole issue on forests, and it was called Forest in Flux in Science. And they were really interested in which part of the world, or in what ecosystems, are we seeing this greatest amount of carbon storage, right? So net ecosystem productivity. So product NPP in excess of respiration. And this was based on a whole bunch of, mostly of tower data, right? And what they were arguing here is that boreal forest is actually seeing an increase in NEP, so accumulating carbon, temperate forests, and tropical forests. How do you account for the fact that tropical forests are increasing so much of their carbon storage? What's happening in the tropics? A lot of those formerly deforested landscapes are now secondary forests, and they're rapidly recovering, right? After a disturbance in the tropics, you can walk back. I actually felt this firsthand. In the place I was working in, we used to have these sort of water spouts and cyclone features that would come out of the ocean and rip through this coastal forest that I worked in. And they would just knock it down, just like a hurricane would. And then you'd go back 2 years later, and it was so thick you couldn't even walk through it, right? So they're just rapidly recovering. And that's probably the signal in tropical forests that we're seeing, is the recovery of formerly deforested landscapes, which is now a huge part of the Amazon especially. And that's tropical forests. The signal of tropical forests mostly is reflecting what's happening in the Amazon, because it's just so big.
So is this just on like a century time ago, or is this post-disturbance, immediately post-disturbance productivity? Or
No,
carbon?
this is just a sort of a synthesis of data from, and this is pretty recent. So this would be, they were trying to argue that this is current net ecosystem productivity, right? From a bunch of different sites. The signal here is probably recovery from large-scale deforestation in the eastern United States. I'm not sure what this one is. Anyone have any thoughts about why boreal forests might be growing more?
Well, the extent of the forest itself could be moving north due to climate change.
Okay, so there's definitely some migration of boreal forests northward. What else has changed that would really affect?
Huge fires.
Okay, so fires could be a part of it. And I would argue climate change as well, and increasing temperatures, right? Because this is a part of the world where temperature strongly constrains growth, right? And if you warm up the cool parts of the world, then you would expect forests to grow. But probably a combination of all those: disturbance, climate, all of those things.
Didn't you say there's that science paper came out showing that in some tropical forests, temperature is causing respiration to catch up or surpass?
Well, in some tropical forests in warm years,
Yeah.
yeah, so if you look at and there are very few of these, but if you look at the sites where there are long-term data on productivity, what you find is that there's more productivity in relatively cool years and less productivity in relatively warm years. So, yeah, and there are actually people arguing that the tropics are right at this sort of temperature threshold. Many people, if you look at the literature, people are arguing about this potential savannaization of tropical forests, that they're going to get to the point where there's temperatures are too high, average temperatures are too high to actually sustain and allow tropical forests to recover, and then there'll be some sort of fundamental state change in a lot of, especially dry tropical forests. Okay, so this is driven by microbial processes. Microbes are the engines that are driving almost all of this. Right? I would actually, you could safely ignore what animals are doing. Right? Animals, I would argue, are mostly transforming or chopping up organic material. A very small proportion of it is actually lost from animals. So the majority of this is bacteria and fungi. Okay, so NPP is adding organic matter, right? Some of that organic matter is actually being incorporated into soils, but most of it is coming right back through this process, heterotrophic respiration, okay? And that the difference in those, we know, is what we see in soils. How long does carbon stay in soils? Anyone have any guesses? If this leaf avoids, and nothing avoids decomposition, at least in in that it gets converted heavily by microorganisms. Carbon is the most limiting thing to organisms in soils, right? So the bacteria, if you add carbon to soils, like if you dump sugar on soils, it goes right back up as CO2. So they're greatly starved for carbon. So most of what plant material comes, the carbon that's stored in soils is not just pieces of plants, right? Carbon is heavily processed, and through every sort of cycle through decomposition, you get left with a compound that's relatively more resistant to further decomposition. And those are the things that get stuck in soils. So how long does that stuff get stuck in soils? Do you have any ideas? It varies depending on the chemistry. There's some carbon that has its sort of cycles probably on like 10-year timescales, and some that cycles on 100-year timescales, and then there's a pool of solar organic matter that can last for 1,000 years. And those are relevant when thinking about how to increase carbon storage and why soils are viewed as a potential way to do that. Because in the oceans, it's very little of the carbon that gets produced by NPP on an annual basis actually stays in the ocean. Okay, a very small fraction is thought to sink to the deep ocean. Okay, and then that can get locked up for 1,000 years, but the proportion of carbon, managing the carbon cycle in the oceans to store carbon is much more challenging. So soils really are seen as a way to increase, and most of the carbon sink in the world that we talk about when we talk about the carbon cycle, right? Humans add 8 gigatons of carbon to the atmosphere every year, but we can only really measure 4 of it, okay? And that suggests that globally, that the mostly terrestrial ecosystems are providing a sink for carbon, okay, and that's soils.
So Corey, could you go back to that last slide? So this is carbon fluxes, would active carbon pools in these various ecosystems look like the inverse of that?
Thoughts? What would it change?
I'm
what
sorry,
would positive NEP do to pools?
Not active. I meant passive. So perhaps dead, carbon stored as dead tissue.
Good question. Who wants to take a stab at that? This is a flux. What is a positive NEP doing to pools?
Decreases the storage. Positive NEP?
So
Oh, no, it increases the storage, sorry.
yeah, so the pools are getting bigger, right? And in a non-steady state ecosystem, well, in a steady state ecosystem, inputs equals outputs. In a non-steady state ecosystem, when inputs are greater than outputs, that's a non-steady state system in which pool size is increasing. So you would predict that with ecosystems with positive fluxes, the only way that can happen, or as a necessary consequence of that, pool sizes are getting bigger. That's the storage part of that.
But if you're talking about inactive soil carbon, in the tropics, right? I've never been to the tropics, but I can only imagine, based on what I've read too, that, it's really poor soil quality in most of the living biomass. Most of the carbon is stored as living biomass, so,
Okay, I'm gonna stop you right there. So yes, we need to think about soils in a couple of different ways. So I have made the argument, and there's lots of data and lots of research showing that in terms of a couple of chemical properties of soils, they are low fertility, for example, relatively low cation exchange, all those things. Does that mean that they don't have any carbon?
No, because they're still pretty productive.
They're still productive, so that's the source. But once carbon gets to soils, what would be the mechanisms that you would store soil carbon? Remember when did I talk about in here how carbon gets stored in soils? I did. The physical and chemical kind of storage of carbon, chemically, right? Recalcitrant carbon, but physically in aggregates. Is that ringing a bell? Ding. So, if you have, just because you have low fertility soils doesn't mean there's no carbon in them. And in fact, the soil development and the extent of weathering and carbon actually has promoted soil carbon storage, right? So the concentrations might be kind of low, but if you have 40 meters of soil and all of it has some organic matter stuck to aggregates or inside of aggregates or stuck to, exchange sites, then that translates to a lot of soil carbon. So don't get confused by the fact that low fertility soils, right? Or don't conflate low fertility soils with no carbon soils. There's lots of soil carbon in the tropics, and it's just not it's not as visible. You don't get organic horizons or big peat layers or anything like that, but it's still there. A proportion of what gets decomposed every year still gets stored in these soils. But this is probably mostly, if you're measuring fluxes, this is really probably showing what growth is doing, right? And so in most of these systems, growth is greatly in excess of respiration, and over the long term, you would expect that would translate to an increase in pool sizes. But every year, the pool size or the increase in soil carbon is probably pretty small. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, so how do we think about and actually calculate decomposition? So here's our pool, right? Here's our mass, and here's our flux. So here's NPP, right? It's contributing to a pool, and then we get an efflux or a loss out of that system. Okay, so if you divide the flux by the pool, that gives you the proportion, right? So what proportion of this is coming in every year, and we refer to that as K, the proportionality constant. So to get the flux, you could rearrange that to proportion that's lost times the pool size. Right? And so we talk, and you'll see decomposition. K is how decomposition is generally represented, and it's just the constant. So the turnover, this proportionality constant that shows kind of the ratio of flux to the pool size. Okay, and then again, you can rearrange that however you want to get any of those terms. Okay, so F, what does F represent? Flux. So litter organic, and we think about this in terms of decomposition, this would be the litter fall pool plus roots, right? Contributing to biomass losses by respiration, right? So what would be the units of K generally? K is actually in units of over time. Okay, so over what time scale are these fluxes happening? And typically you'll see decomposition as per year are the units of K. Okay, so over what time scale, and you can calculate turnover times. I'll show you how to do that in a second. But you could, if you divide, actually, I don't even need to wait. If you divide, right, the mass divided by the flux, it would give you how many years does that pool stay there. It's the same way if you think about water in a reservoir, right? If you divide the flux out by, if you divide the pool by the flux, it would tell you how long it would be before you emptied that reservoir. Okay, and so again, and for most of you, this is not going to be relevant unless you're looking and doing decomposition types of studies, the specifics of this. But oftentimes, again, you'll see the proportionality K. So if you look at a figure of decomposition, they'll show Ks. And it can be days, it can be months, it can be years. It just depends on the use. It depends really what the rates are and what's most relevant. Okay, so again, we're talking about mass balance here, and that if in is not equal to out, then you have a non-steady state system. Okay, as opposed to a system where fluxes are the same, then you have a steady state system in which the pool size is not increasing. Okay, so steady state is when F in is equal to F out, and M is not changing, and by definition, non-steady state is occurring when these two terms are different. Okay, and this is this idea that I haven't emphasized enough probably to this point, but mass balance in ecosystems, right? Almost everything we look at is, in ways of calculating things, we're dealing with mass balance at some level, right? The laws of thermodynamics. And if you have a difference between these fluxes, then that's going to translate to a change in storage, right? The same way we thought about water and ecosystems, right? So precipitation, evapotranspiration, and the difference between those is a change in storage. The same applies here. Inputs minus outputs equals a change in storage. And the change can either be an accumulation or a loss, a net loss of carbon. Okay, so turnover time, M divided by S, right? So the mass in the pool divided by the flux out, and we know the other way we know that this is, you solve for these, one has a time component and one doesn't. So when we calculate a turnover time, right, the units would be, well, depending if typically carbon fluxes are on, you know, the NEP fluxes I just showed you were grams of carbon per meter squared per year. Pools would be grams per meter squared, and so when you solve for that turnover time, you get left with years. And this is tricky, right? Because this is, all of this depends on an ecosystem being in steady state. Are there any ecosystems in the world that are at steady state? Even if you do your very best to control for steady stateness, it's almost impossible, right? Because there are global changes, right? Especially like CO2. You can't account. There is no such thing as a steady state with the carbon cycle now because of the changes in CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. That's why we have assumptions, right? We just got to make assumptions. Over this time scale, we're assuming that this is at steady state, right? So clearly over large time scales that we violate steady state. But if we're looking at what's happening right now, right? You'll see this in lots of these sorts of ecosystem studies is the assumption of steady state. So studying nitrogen fixation, how much nitrogen fixation, if we want to solve for nitrogen fixation by measuring up all the other pools, right, and saying that the difference between N fixation and losses is, or the difference between all other inputs of nitrogen and nitrogen losses is nitrogen fixation, then we have to make some assumptions about steady state. And we do it all the time, right? Same with water. The water balance, water, looking at water fluxes and water cycling systems, you have to make assumptions about steady state. Okay, so then again, to be totally redundant, this is the turnover constant, or also known as the proportionality constant, and it indicates that turnover is proportional to the size of the reservoir. So, in this case, S is equal to a proportion of the mass of this pool size. Right, so we can solve for turnover time, pool over flux, or we can use this proportionality constant. S is equal to K times M to get what fraction of, use the proportionality constant to establish what fraction of that pool size is lost every year. Questions? Makes sense? More or less? Okay, so what does this look like, or how in sort of an ecosystems context, how does this translate to something that we may be able to conceptualize a bit more? So here's our inputs, right? Here's our entire soil organic matter pool. here's our losses. Okay, most organic matter that escapes complete decomposition or mineralization to CO2 enters this litter layer, and that stuff turns over in 10s or fewer years. Okay? As this stuff is being decomposed, this isn't just moving down, right? This is being heavily processed by microorganisms, right? And they're ripping energy out of those compounds, and the products of that are something more difficult to decompose than what you started with. And that's the stuff that tends to enter these what we call, nothing is permanent, but permanent accumulations in the lower profile. Okay, so things like humic acids, humans, fulvic acids, organic acids, okay, that are both byproducts of the plants, but also byproducts of the microbes that are decomposing those plants. And these things turn over on a really long time scale. So they are the place where we could expect long-term storage. Okay, so the numbers here, this is from a very specific type of ecosystem. It's just really meant to illustrate. There's nothing, this would vary as you move from system to system. But most of it sits in this pool up here. Well, most of it is decomposed very rapidly and lost to CO2, probably right from the litter layer. This is the stuff that accumulates much more slowly. Okay? And that when you start doing things in agricultural systems like tilling soils and doing things like that, then suddenly you bring this stuff to the surface. These are protected not just chemically, but also because of where they are. Right? And so disturbing soils makes these more susceptible, certainly more than 1,000 years, if you bring it back to the surface. So, how do you measure decomposition? This is, I did a decomposition study once in the tropics. I spent a week making like 1,500 of these bags filled with litter. So you just actually collect litter in litter traps. So the trees drop their leaves, you collect all of that, bag it up into giant bags. Then you weigh out specific quantities. You can see the orange thing here, these are these lanyards. So you'd make a strand of litter bags that all weigh about the same. You deploy them in an ecosystem, and then over time you pick up a bag. So we come through once every month, snip a bag off of our strand here, and measure it, weigh it. And so it gives you a time course of mass loss of litter. And that's what decomposition is, or how it's measured typically. It's just mass loss of litter over time. When you do that, you get a very, very predictable, at least shape of that relationship. Exponential decay is almost, I would say, exclusively. Decomposition follows an exponential decay relationship. So we start with 100%. We lose mass, but over time, the rate of mass loss decreases. Okay? So the slope of this line is steeper than the slope of this line. And it follows, if you fit an exponential decay, this exponential decay model to this, it would perfectly predict that time course of decomposition. And almost all, if you look at litter or decomposition or organic matter decomposition studies, they almost all follow negative exponential decay. Okay, and again, you see some terms here. This term has this K, right? And so this is where when people are calculating decomposition, you'll see K. Okay, so big Ks mean really fast decomposition, little Ks mean very slow decomposition. Why do we have a negative exponential decay relationship? Why is this so common? Any guesses? Why would decomposition be faster early on than it is late? I'll give you a hint. There's a physical part of decomposition that's important and helps understand that, and a chemical one.
There are more complex molecules available for decom, and they're less recalcitrant
Early on.
early on.
Okay, perfect. Like what? What sorts of compounds would be less recalcitrant, or would be, yeah, so so labile would be did everyone know what I mean by recalcitrant? Recalcitrant is jargon we haven't talked about yet. Just resistant to decomposition, chemically resistant to decomposition.
So like the leaf structure itself would be like lignin or cellulose or whatever, and that would be resistant. But whatever, like the plasm that's inside of the leaf might be.
How many people had coffee or tea this morning? Coffee and tea is leaves or seeds, right? So when you make a cup of tea, right, the stuff that leaches when you add water to your cup is this stuff, right? And it's really kind of dissolved stuff that when you add water to it, sorry, it's not dissolved, it's stuff that when you add water to it, it dissolves. So simple sugars, anything that's water soluble. But most of what you add in your tea, right, is not water soluble. You take your tea bag, it'll be a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of mass loss in the tea bag after you make a cup of tea, right? But early on, this physical process of leaching is going to take all that stuff out, right? And once you deplete that stuff, then you're going to slow down the rate of mass loss. Okay? You're leaching that easy to dissolve stuff and over time you would expect that to play out where when you get done with decomposition, or when you get done with, not when you get done with decomposition, but over time, the stuff that's left is really, really difficult. If you made a cup of tea and drank it and then filled your cup again and drank it and did it 4 or 5 times, by the end you'd be drinking basically just water, right? Because you leach all that stuff early on. Okay, so that's generally, so there's a physical part of that, so some stuff is soluble, but also some stuff is more easily decomposed, and that's going to be up here at the beginning. The stuff that's easy is going to be decomposed much more quickly than the stuff that's later on. I will point out, so this is my site where I worked in the tropics that gets 6 or 7 meters of rain a year. Almost all of this litter decomposes in less than a year. So I was saying, I think when you go in the dry season, there's a litter pool that's this high, that's like up to your knees. And then when you come back less than a year later, it's completely gone. It's just mineral soil. So that stuff decomposes really quickly. This is one of the fastest, this would be K, this is a value of about 4. Really, so rapid rates of decomposition, high K values. Most of the world, if you did something like this, you would find after 2 years, still more than half of it remains. Okay, so this is a little typical. Yeah?
In really dry environments, would that line be closer to linear because there's less water for the initial leaching stage to occur?
Thoughts? Yes or no? What do you think?
I would think yes.
I would think yes too. And in fact, yeah, so not only is it flatter, but the exponential decay part of it is much harder to see because it's the total net change in mass loss in dry ecosystems over the same amount of time is much lower. So you might expect, ultimately I would still expect some sort of negative exponential decay because of the chemical part of this, right? So even if you don't have the physical leaching part of this, you still have the chemical, there's amino acids and sugars and things that are going to decompose more rapidly. But ultimately, yes, I would expect a much less obvious exponential decay.
Would that kind of represent the soil profile too, like in a drier ecosystem, like turnover rates kind of more of a shallow?
Great question. So how would you expect turnover times to vary as you move through the soil profile? this is turnover time, right? And so the same thing is, I would argue the same thing is reflected here, right? This turnover, right, so that's just pool divided by flux. Turnover is thousands, and that's reflecting the fact that chemically those things are much more resistant, but also the environment down here is much less conducive to decomposition than the environment.
Yeah, there's no fragmentation of the litter.
Yeah, well,
Or
it's
not as much.
most of this was fragmented a long time ago, right? This is dissolved stuff largely, right? Or at least it's molecular kind of, it's molecules of things, it's not chunks of things. Okay? But yeah, so it's a perfect sort of, there's a very appropriate analogy there between what you would expect to happen in the controls on decomposition above ground versus what's happening below ground. Since you asked the question too, there's been some really cool studies showing that in dry systems, most of decomposition is not even biological. Okay? It's actually by the sun. So photodegradation of organic matter. So people have done some really cool litter bag types of experiments in dry ecosystems, and they've done it with fungicides and antibiotics, and they've done it in litter bags that exclude organisms of different sizes. And basically what you find is that, and they've done it with UV shielding, right? So as another treatment, how much is ultraviolet radiation contributing to decomposition? And what you find is that in those systems, the majority of mass loss is happening from photodegradation of organic matter. Right? Just like if we sat out in the sun in a desert, we would photodegrade. And that doesn't necessarily follow an exponential decay. That would be much a process that and I haven't looked carefully at those, but there's no reason to suspect that would follow an exponential decay. Okay, so the main processes would include leaching. So this is our cup of tea in the morning, transfers of solid materials, not to our teacup, but to the soil, right? And we've done studies like this where we built litter layer lysimeters. So you take take a pipe, cut it in half, put it under the litter layer with some sort of screen on it, and then a tube coming out of that into a jug. And I did this is part of my PhD and postdoc. And you find that forests are making lots of tea. Okay, it's the same, it looks the same, it smells the same. It's just, that's where I picked up the tea analogy, because when you collect these and it's like tea colored and it's exactly the same sort of thing. Early on too, remember most leaves are just big chunks of organic matter. And so the simple process of decomposition and mineralization happens on smaller pieces faster than it does on bigger pieces, right? So you increase the surface area of those little chunks compared to the big chunks, right? Or the surface area to volume. It increases more opportunities for microbes to attack those. Okay, and then lastly, or not lastly in terms of importance, but the third kind of major process involved here is chemical alteration, right? And so the chemicals that are most likely to be altered early on are the really simple ones, and the chemicals that are going to be most resistant to that are the ones that stick around longest. Okay, so here's the figure I just showed you, and this is kind of a conceptual representation of decomposition in the process that suggests early on these soluble carbon products are most easily lost, right? Then these other chemical components, they actually, over time, they become proportionately more larger than the things that get lost early on. Right, and these are the things, the big structural components of leaves that are more resistant to decomposition. Okay, and then as you move through time, lignin, I haven't talked about lignin, cellulose and lignin, the structural kind of big long chains of carbon molecules that have low nutrient concentrations, high carbon concentrations. a lot of decomposition really is just about organisms trying to get not just carbon, but also nitrogen, right? So the compounds that get decomposed first are the ones that have both of those. Okay, these have relatively low concentrations of nitrogen, and so they just decompose much more slowly. Okay, but over time, you would expect that organic matter is dominated by these really resistant compounds and the products of decomposing all of this stuff. Okay, but early, you get the leaching, and that's phase 1 here, this really rapid leaching of things. I will say too, here's mass remaining and here's time on this axis. And look, tropics, right? We were basically at 20 after 1 year, but that's even really fast for the tropics. Okay, but much higher rates of decomposition in the tropics than you would expect in the Arctic. Okay? That's the climate, again, signal on decomposition. Okay, so litter layer, and probably lots of you have been in ecosystems where you get like black water rivers or high soluble, like humic rivers, and that's just this soluble stuff leaching through soils and into aquatic ecosystems.
Where's that picture on the right?
Hawaii. So Hawaii has, and a part of what happens in Hawaii too is the type of soils that they have. So the andesol soils, they store a lot of carbon in the soluble forms, but then it just leaches out over time. Okay, so phase 2 here, and recognize that these don't occur in actual phases. They're all happening at the same time. You would just predict that this is dominated by losses of cell solubles, right? And that this would be more important, that labile substrate decomposition would be more important after you've lost all of these soluble contents. And then the last phase here, and hopefully you can see, if we divide this into these 3 phases, distinct slopes. So high slope, medium, low. Okay, reflecting the fact that this happens rapidly, not as rapidly, and slowest. And these are the things that you would predict would stick around in soils and actually become part of that long-term soil organic matter pool. Okay, and why, like in maple forests, we have less accumulation of organic material than we do in spruce forests. Some of that is climate, but a lot of it is just chemical variation between those two. Okay, and a maple leaf is a lot gummier to a microbe than a spruce needle. Okay, so let's look at a couple of different systems. So remember that K is the flux divided by the mass. So here's K4, 1, 0.25, 0.1. Okay, so high rates of decomposition, low rates of decomposition. Okay, here's litter fall and forest floor, so how much carbon is accumulating in these ecosystems. Okay, in the tropics, you have lots of litter fall. High rates of decomposition translates to low pool sizes of carbon. Okay, so you don't find organic horizons typically in tropical forest soils. If we go out to a temperate coniferous forest, we have relatively low amounts of litter fall, but really slow rates of decomposition translates to lots of organic matter accumulating in those soils. Okay? This one's interesting. So climate is relatively similar between temperate conifer and temperate deciduous, and yet we have very different decomposition dynamics going on here. So conifers, this is suggesting have lower rates of turnover than deciduous. Okay, so they store more carbon, and yet the climate is the same. And this has to be about something else, right? So this does reflect the importance of litter chemistry on decomposition. So plant matter, organic matter chemistry. Okay, so here we are again with our list of things that matter for decomposition. So here's an obvious signal of climate and litter chemistry. What else would influence rates of decomposition? Okay, so we could sort of think about climate in terms of temperature and moisture, right? Okay, so not just the plants and the chemistry of the plants themselves, but maybe the decomposer community? Totally. Anything else? Nutrients. Okay, so temperature, remember, this is just another set of enzymes. Enzyme processes strongly influenced by temperature and mostly exponential relationships. Moisture, and I've already talked about this at some level, the direct effects of too much or too little rainfall, but also how too much or too little rainfall affects other things like nutrients or substrate quality or decomposer community composition. Okay, does everyone see the difference between that distinction between a direct versus an indirect effect? Lots of these in ecosystem science as well. Okay, substrate quality, how, like more jargon. So the opposite of recalcitrant would be labile. So how easily or difficult it is to decompose based on the chemical composition. Nutrients, and I think I'll show you something that really points to that. I think I will. If I don't, I'll show it to you on the board. And then this one, this was something that generally hadn't been considered as an important, well, maybe that it wasn't, it just hadn't been considered. Okay, most of the time when I started my graduate work, for example, people thought a lot about these things, but there wasn't as much thought into this, and there's been a lot of work showing that, yeah, if you control for all these other things, this one really does matter. You don't have as diverse of a community or as an abundant of a decomposer community, and how could you possibly have as high of rates of decomposition? This one is harder to actually measure, so it's only recently been looked at. Okay, here we go. Temperature, direct effects on microbial activity. They tend to follow this positive exponential relationship, so rates increase as you get warmer. Okay, and then you, depending on the ecosystem, you might actually expect that if you get too hot, that things will actually start to decrease, or rates of decomposition would decrease. Okay, and this high temperature not necessarily optimum for microbes, because microbes are adapted to temperature just like in the system that they exist, just like plants or animals are. Okay, so if you take a cold community, microbial community, and make it warmer, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to do better. It might actually do worse. This one's a bit messy. Look at that. So here's temperature and soil respiration. Okay? And for the same reasons it's difficult to find really tight relationships between temperature and NPP, the same thing applies here. All these other controls start to matter. So you see clearly that as you increase temperature, respiration rates go up, but there's so much noise in there, right? Because different systems with the same temperature might have totally different amounts of rainfall, or totally different fertility, or totally different organisms. Right? And so when we're looking for patterns, like if we wanted to know what's the effect of climate change or an increase in global temperature on respiration, yikes. You're measuring all over the place, and you have this much variability, it's going to be really difficult to see any sort of pattern there. Okay, I was going to walk through, I'm not going to spend much time here, the directs versus the indirect effects. So the temperature direct effects on microbial activity, which affects soil respiration. Most, I would argue, and this is showing that most of the direct effects of temperature, most of the effects of temperature are are either mediated by other things like moisture or that they're indirect. So temperature might affect rates of weathering, which affects nutrient availability, which affects plant growth, right? As opposed to temperature directly affecting rates of the microbial process. Okay, so, but both are important. But largely, there's lots of interactions, and many of these effects of temperature are happening through their effects on other things that would then affect rates of soil respiration or decomposition. So this is cool. So this was a study that I think came out, oh, there it is, 2010. So this is an important question, right? So how has climate change, think about all the carbon sitting in ecosystems, right? And so even if climate change just has a tiny effect on the balance between inputs and losses, right, that contributes to more carbon coming in. So even if we have a 1.00001% increase in soil respiration fluxes as a result of climate change, then that's a big amount of carbon from global ecosystems into the atmosphere. And so this has been a really important, and I guess recently people have really started to understand what is the relationship between temperature and global soil respiration, right? How might we expect, or how has current climate change contributed to soil respiration, but then moving forward, how might we expect ecosystems to respond to further increases and changes? And this was one of those, this came out in 2010. It was a global analysis, so here's annual global respiration through time. And the gray, which you probably can't see very well here, that's the variability and the confidence which we have in this, but clearly a trend suggesting an increase in global respiration. And that makes sense at some level, right? If we're getting warmer, you would expect, all other things being equal, that respiration would go up. I like this, but within the period covered by the entire database and should be considered speculative. But ultimately, and there's lots of this going back and forth and debate in the literature about the effects of climate. I'll show you another one, a more recent one even, that has addressed this from a set of experimental, actually two differing experimental perspectives on this. But you would predict that increases in temperature globally would increase rates of respiration. That doesn't necessarily mean losses of carbon from ecosystems, because those same increases could increase productivity. Here's one from like just recently, and I'm sorry I don't have the date on here. This came out in the last couple of years with 1 million authors. Basically, these folks looked at respiration, and let's see, I didn't put the x-axis on here, across biome types. I'm guessing it's temperature. Okay, thank you. Soil temperature. So, and the blue ones are controls. So these are from experimental manipulations of temperature. So the blue ones are controls, and the red ones are experimentally manipulated, like soil warming experiments. And what these folks found was that there really is no difference in response to warming across this whole range of experiments. Okay, so it's a hard question, right? Okay, and then this week or last week, this was October 6th. So here's a study, a long-term study from Harvard Forest, okay, in Massachusetts, I believe, where these guys set up a soil warming experiment. They put like miles of wires in the soils and have used those to do a soil warming and heating experiment. And this has been going on for 26 years now. Okay, to try and figure out how is warming, you might make a couple of predictions about how warming would affect soil respiration over the long term. What's one? If you were designing and thinking about this experiment, how would you predict, or what would be the hypothesis about rates, long-term rates of soil respiration? Would you expect that they would go up indefinitely and endlessly?
Wouldn't you think that they would just reflect productivity? So
productivity went up to a point, respiration would do the same, and then if it flattened out.
Okay, but if we have a set of control plots and an experimental set of plots, and productivity is basically doing the same in both of them, how would you predict warming alone to affect soil respiration, and as a comparison between those controls and those experimental treatments? Given what you know about sort of pools and fluxes and controls, what would you suspect? Yeah.
I think that maybe initially there wouldn't be a big difference like we saw in the first experiment, and then over time maybe as the organisms and environment kind of caught up to it, the productivity and the respiration would increase maybe to a point.
And then what would happen?
With the
Okay, so and that could suggest a couple of different things. One, maybe they run out of carbon, right? So it doesn't matter if they're decomposing carbon and they accelerate rates of decomposition in response to temperature, but productivity doesn't keep pace, then you might expect that they bump into some other limitation. It's not temperature anymore that limits how much they're respiring, but maybe it's carbon substrate. What else could be a possible? Yeah.
So potentially a similar curve where it plateaus out to a value at the top, but maybe because the community of decomposers doesn't operate very well at a higher temperature, so temperature, and I don't know if the study, if they like increased it slowly over time, or how much temperature ended up going, or if they
I
just.
think it's always been the same, and I'm not exactly sure what the temperature was. It wasn't a huge change, but I think they just turned it on. They flipped a switch, basically. They didn't ramp it up. But finish your thought.
Oh, and yeah, so, depending on how they change the temperature, it can like change the decomposer community or impact it somehow.
Exactly. So you might expect that there's something going on there, either that the community adapts to the change in temperature, right? And sort of down-regulates rates of respiration, or maybe you get a change in community that somehow alters things.
What if they get drier too?
Good question. I don't know how they dealt with water.
Increasing evaporation.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, and I don't know the answer, how they controlled for moisture. We'd have to look. That's a really good point, though. Well, here's what they showed. So, kind of both, right? So initially, these are cumulative soil carbon losses. So this is the difference between the control plots versus the heated plots. Okay, so this is our response. And this is in megagrams of carbon per hectare. So early on, there was a clear increase in carbon losses in response to the temperature. And then it kind of plateaued, right? So maybe they're running into carbon, or maybe they're adapting, or whatever. But then they break this into several phases. But then something else happened that caused an increase again. Okay, and they argue that some of these are actually what we've talked about, right? So like this one, maybe they're running out of carbon here, or carbon is getting more scarce, and so they slow down. But then the community changes, and so then maybe you sort of cultivate a community that's more able to decompose some of these resistant things. Maybe you change the proportion of fungi versus bacteria, and they explain, or kind of try to explain all of this through those various mechanisms. Okay, but this is just, right, this was last week. Okay, so these are really kind of important and right now sorts of questions that people are struggling with, because we might be, I wish I knew what the temperature increase was, but this is not pushing the system in a big way. This was a fairly subtle increase in soil temperature that's driving massive 15 megagrams of carbon per hectare losses between warmed versus non-warmed plots. That is a scary sort of scenario if you think about all the carbon sitting in soils and the fact that things are getting warmer. Okay, and it's one of the few, it's certainly the longest experimental study of its kind like this. Okay, but it does paint a pretty kind of harsh picture of what climate change might do to soil carbon balances. And this, the reference is on here if anyone wants to look it up. Okay, so Monday, you guys, if anyone wants to come talk, you guys feeling good about Monday? It's gonna be easy. If you've been to class and you read the material and you're thinking about that stuff, not just don't try and memorize things, do you prepare? But I think